So I'm passionate about food, eating local, eating sustainably, supporting local farmers, and gardening. And today we're talking about preserving the harvest, saving today's abundance to enjoy tomorrow, because all of the wonderful produce that is available right now, both in your gardens, at the farmers market, even at the store, is wonderful, but you can only eat so much at dinner, and then you need to do something with the rest of it. So I want to start by talking about some good reasons for preserving your food, especially locally grown food versus shopping at the grocery store. So if you garden, then it's because you're overwhelmed with the abundance that comes all at once, whether that be berries or squash or tomatoes, and saving some for later allows you to enjoy it in the winter. You can support local farmers by buying in bulk at the farmers market or in various farm stands around and preserving for later. You can choose the varieties that you like best, the quality that goes into what you're preserving, and you can decide what it tastes like. You know, if you're really into heavy spice, you can put heavy spice as opposed to being subject to whatever's available at the store. You can eliminate transportation costs by buying local and preserving for later. And it's generally also much more sustainable, using much less packaging. I have here lots of reusable jars, and you don't have all that plastic that comes, or cans, or whatever that comes with things from the grocery store. So to me, there are 4 general ways to preserve food for later. The first, and I'm going to talk about them in my opinion in easiest to most complicated. And easiest is using your refrigerator. The second is using your freezer, then dehydrating, and then finally canning. So before we really get into this, I want to make sure I stress, with any preserving method, the point is to slow down the spoilage process. It does not stop it, and you need to always assess what your preserved items are before you consume them. If anything is moldy, slimy, smells funky, off, be safe, throw it out. Okay, so now the fun stuff. We'll start with the refrigerator. The refrigerator is easy to store things like carrots, beets, apples, just in the refrigerator. You put them in now, they'll last for months. Just the veggie drawer, maybe a plastic bag if that's easier. No complexity at all. A little more complex is refrigerator pickles. And I have brought my pickled tomatoes. I just made these yesterday with green tomatoes. And for everyone online, I believe it was distributed to you. For everyone here, there is a handout. I am providing my recipe for pickled tomatoes along with refrigerator pickled cucumbers. Essentially, you make a vinegar water with a little sugar, a little salt concoction. You bring that to a boil. You stick your tomatoes or your cucumbers or your cauliflower or whatever it is you want to pickle into your jar, your clean, sterilized jar with whatever extra spices. You pour the boiling mixture, the vinegar water mixture, over it, seal it up. As soon as it cools, you stick it in the refrigerator, because this is not shelf stable. This is refrigerator only, because the jar itself is not necessarily shelf sealed. These jars are great. They have the hinge and the little rubber gasket. You can pick these up at the thrift store all the time. If the gaskets are not good, they sell just the gaskets at the kitchen store here in Blacksburg. You can reuse these over and over and over again. And then This will last in the refrigerator for months. Typically, my favorite thing Thanksgiving is to serve pickled tomatoes along with everything else. Another thing that I do in the refrigerator is it's an herb bouillon with lots of veggie scraps. It's parsley stems and onions is a big base, carrots, but carrot tops. And again, I've provided the recipe here, but you combine that, all of these veggies with and herbs, all sorts of good stuff, fennel, cilantro. There's a little bit of dried tomato in there, a little bit of lemon peel with salt. And it's a significant amount of salt. Process that in a food processor. And then you can use this when you cook rice or potatoes, you make soup. It's a bouillon. It'll last for, this actually is from last year. That I think is a great way to both use your scraps and preserve all that wonderful fresh taste for the winter. And a friend of mine absolutely loves this as the only way that they will eat rice now. Yes.
I actually want to ask before I ask the question, do you want us to hold questions to the end, or as questions pop up, or as you're describing the things?
I was going to get questions at the end of each fridge section. So if you want to go ahead and ask your question, that's fine.
Okay, I had a question about the pickles. Do you pour the boiling temperature water over the stuff into the jar, or do you, okay, so you do that, you don't wait for it to cool?
No, hot boiling on it.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. Green tomatoes as a pickle are nice and crunchy. Yeah. I think if you put boiling stuff over red tomatoes, you'll end up with sauce. And it's actually something I grew up with as a kid. I love pickled tomatoes. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. In general, the question was, when are we going to take questions? And then do you pour boiling vinegar water mixture over the tomatoes or the cucumbers? And it's yes, while it is very hot, you pour it, and then you seal it, and then you wait for it to cool, and then you stick it in the fridge. Another thing that I like to do that preserves fruit is a fruit syrup or a fruit cordial, depending on your preference for alcohol or not, where I cook up blackberries or raspberries. I actually do currants in my garden. I have a lot of currants with some sugar, strain it so that it's doesn't have the seeds, and then add some alcohol, either vodka or rum, depending on your tastes. I'm sorry? Or brandy, yes. Thank you. And then it'll store in the refrigerator for a very long time that way. Or without the alcohol, it can be a fruit syrup to pour onto pancakes. So that's generally the freezer thing, or the refrigerator thing. There's the pickles, the pickled stuff. There's stuff that just stores easily in the refrigerator. There's cordials. Anyone have any other questions about refrigerator?
Did the bouillon stuff, did you pour? Did it have any hot water over it?
No, this is just ground veggies and salt. There's nothing else added to that. It's ground veggies and salt. Yes.
They're not desiccated, they're sort of like what form are
It kind of becomes a paste.
okay, you don't pre-desiccate them. They're like it's just the scraps of vegetables, the salt, and whatever other herbs.
Yes,
Okay.
it's the veggies, and you stick it in a food processor or a blender until it's a paste. And again, that's one of the recipes I've included, so you're welcome to try that as well. Yes.
So you mentioned earlier about putting apples and things like that in the fridge just for long-term storage. You need to wrap them or anything. I've heard about wrapping them in like paper towels, which seems like such a waste, you know? Do you do that or do you just set them in there and just let them?
So the question is, when you're storing fruits and vegetables in the refrigerator, how do you store them? And for apples, I just throw them in my fruit bin.
Okay.
For beets, I tend to put them in a plastic bag. They keep a little moister that way. Carrots also, I'll tend to store them in the plastic bag that they tend to come in so that they have a little bit of moisture with them. There are reusable containers that I know, like Tupperware cells, that will monitor that moisture so you have a okay amount of moisture so that things don't dry out. But I find that certainly apples will last a good while.
Okay.
And so will the carrots, and so will the beets, parsnips, those kinds of things. Now, obviously, if you have a root cellar, great, that's even better. But not all of us have a root cellar or the ability to replicate one. So is there an online question?
There is. So what is the best way to handle excess squash?
What is the best way to handle excess squash? In my personal opinion, that's zucchini bread all the way. Make zucchini bread, put it in the freezer, and you've got zucchini bread for the winter. But obviously, not everybody wants lots of zucchini bread. So there are other options. We'll talk about dehydrating some later. And there are people who like to freeze squash. Now it loses its consistency, but it can be good if you're going to put it into soups or stews. Question?
I would say, we use our zucchini and non squash, and we grate it up and we make a pizza crust.
Okay, so somebody here grates up their zucchini and makes a pizza crust out of it. So there you go. Yes. There's also canning options as well. Yes.
There's another online question. How to make pickled red onions? Do you have recommendations?
I have not made pickled red onions, but my understanding is it's very similar to the pickled tomatoes. I think probably more sugar, but it's a pouring hot vinegar mixture over the onions for a refrigerator type pickle, a quick pickled onion. I'm not a big onion fan, so I haven't done that. But there are recipes everywhere. So go for it, try a recipe. With the refrigerator type of pickles, you have very little risk that it's going to go wrong. It may not be your favorite flavor. It might be too salty. It might be too sweet. It might be not sweet enough. It might be not salty enough, but it's not going to be bad. So you try it and you tweak it the next time if it doesn't work exactly. Let's move on to freezer. And the first thing I'm going to say with a freezer is I think it is extremely important. Maintain a list of what's in your freezer. Because if you don't maintain a list, then essentially you're just sticking it in the garbage in advance and storing it that way. Because we all forget. We all forget. And labeling, yes, that's the other thing. Freezer tape is the best thing ever. It's on everything that I do. All of my dried stuff, all of my refrigerator stuff, you want to make sure you know what it is and when you did it so that you can go, oh, this is 4 years old. Maybe it's time to get rid of that. So yes, make a list, maintain the list. It's not easy to do, but it's the best way to make sure you're using that year the stuff that you put away. So the freezer is obviously another easy way to preserve things. It depends on the item as to how to freeze things. Some things you can just put in the freezer and they're done and they're ready for you. When I do berries, I use a cookie sheet. I'll rinse the berries off, spread them on the cookie sheet on a piece of wax paper. leave them for half an hour or an hour, and then pop them off of the wax paper into my storage container, a Ziploc bag or a jar, whatever works for you. And then they will freeze separately so that you can say, I want a cup for making muffins, and not, oh, look, I've got this blob that's all stuck together. So berries are very easy. It's rinse, freeze, store. Peppers, I find, are super easy. They are really plentiful at the market right now. Chop into pieces, stick in a bag or a jar, freeze, you're done. Corn requires a little more effort. Corn requires, in order to preserve both its flavor and its nutrients, to be blanched first. And blanching is where you immerse it in boiling water for, I think it's about 3-4 minutes. They say longer in some books. I find I like that fresh taste. 3 or 4 minutes, then you take it out of the boiling water, you put it in an ice bath so it cools off quickly. And then I cut the corn off the cobs and stick it in my containers in the freezer, and I've got corn all winter. At this point, I'm going to say the Virginia Cooperative Extension has some fantastic guides. There's one on specifically freezing foods. There's some on preserving foods. And if you go to their website, you can access all of that online, including, I saw when I was looking at the website, a online canning course that you can take. So I highly recommend that. I have definitely learned over the years a lot of my tips for preserving from presentations given by our cooperative extension agents. And in these guides, they'll tell you things like, you need to blanch corn, you don't need to blanch peppers, and then you'll know the best way to preserve each item. Yes, questions?
So you mentioned you learned a lot from cooperative extension and other classes, but did you come to this as an adult completely, or did you start this as a child, where some of this like passed down from family?
So where did I learn all of this wonderful knowledge? All of this is in the last, I'm going to say 18 years. The first thing I started with was blueberry jam. I picked blueberries and I thought, we're going to make jam, and we made jam, and it was great. And I think that was my gateway drug. Yes.
So when you freeze peppers, there's a lot of different kinds of peppers. Let's say bell peppers. When you use them later, I'm assuming they're not really good in a salad, but more like in a soup, or nothing about using them.
So
the texture are a lot different.
So the question is about freezing peppers. And for me, my go-to, I don't know what I'm making for dinner, is I'm making what I call burritos. It's miscellaneous whatever wrapped in a tortilla. And one of my go-tos is my frozen peppers, because they saute up really nicely. So I would say sauteing them, putting them in chili, putting them in soup. But no, I don't think that salad is probably, although I honestly have never just thawed them and eaten them, because I take them right from the freezer to the pan. So saves that whole thawing process. I'm going to suggest another one that I got this from Pete, the bagel guy at the farmer's market. When you make your jack-o'-lantern with your kids, you put your candle in it, you light it up, it sits there for a couple days. Take the candle out, cut all the pumpkin, cook it in the oven, and then puree it. It's still good. If it doesn't get moldy, if you don't let it sit out on your patio until it's covered in ants and sagging, then you can save it and use it as pumpkin for your pumpkin pie in Thanksgiving, November. So, and what I do is I will cook up my pumpkin. Typically I cook up the halves that have been, the seeds come out, cook them in the oven until it's soft, and then scoop out all the flesh and puree it with my immersible blender, or you could use a food processor, whatever works for you. And then I scoop it into 1 cup portions and I store it in the freezer that way, so that I know I've got a 1 cup portion that kind of I can thaw and make into pumpkin pie or pumpkin bread or muffins or whatever.
Does it matter what kind of pumpkin? Cause I remember years ago, I thought I was gonna do that. And I cooked this pumpkin for hours. It never got soft.
I have never had, the question was what kind of pumpkin? Certainly the pie pumpkins are a richer flavor and a less watery version. The jack-o'-lanterns tend to have more water. But if you puree it and let it sit in your refrigerator overnight, it'll separate a little bit and I'll drain off some of the water. And for me, I bought that pumpkin and I'm not going to waste it, even if it's not the perfect pie pumpkin. Nobody's ever complained about my pumpkin pie.
I cooked it forever.
I have not heard of a pumpkin not cooking.
This
So-
was years ago.
I don't know. Yes.
If you're if you're freezing something like ratatouille, that has some liquid in it, what's the best kind of container to put in?
I would definitely use jars. Ball makes these freezer jars that are really nice. I'm sorry?
Can you repeat that?
Oh, yes. The question was about freezing things that are liquidy and what's the best way to store those. And for me, something like these ball jars, and they have larger ones as well, that have a fill line so that you know how to fill it without it exploding in the freezer. Because when things freeze, they do expand a little bit. To me, that's a great option, because then it'll contain. I will say Ziploc bags work really well for freezing things. I know that's not necessarily the most sustainable way, but it's a very functional way to do it. And then you can also store them flatter so that they'll thaw faster rather than a big block. You know, if you get a large jar and put it in the freezer, that's going to take a long time to defrost. Another thing that I love to freeze is pesto. And Tupperware makes these little containers, teeny little things. This is my pesto container. I have a whole stack of them. I make my pesto. And then when I'm ready to make pasta in the winter, I just pop out the little pesto cube. Another option is using an ice cube tray and filling it and then popping out the cubes once they've frozen of pesto and storing those. But to me, it is a fantastic treat to have the pesto with pasta and maybe some rehydrated dried tomatoes, which we'll get to in a little bit, and mozzarella for dinner. Fantastic. Tomato sauce, obviously, we're talking about liquidy things. Tomato sauce, you can make whatever you want in your tomato sauce, or you made tomato sauce for dinner and there's too much. You can store that in a jar in the freezer. Another recipe that I've provided is roasted tomatoes in the freezer. And this is one that I love, where I take the paste tomatoes, typically like the Juliettes or slightly larger than that, cut them in half, pull the seeds out, and spread them on a cookie sheet, not with the wax paper, cookie sheet or a roasting pan with some rosemary and thyme, a little bit of sugar, a little bit of salt, and sprinkled liberally with oil. And you roast it in the oven at high temperature for a bit, and then you drop the temperature down and let it cook until they're really getting reduced in the liquid quantity that's there, and they get that really caramelized edges to them. Once that cools, slide that into your containers, whether it be your jar or your Ziploc bag, and have that over the winter. And it's one of our favorites.
that a freezer recipe also?
That's a freezer recipe, and I've provided that on the little handout. And the last thing is freezer jam, which I think is a nice way to do jam that, again, doesn't involve the complexity of pulling out a canner and having to can. You can make a small quantity and then fill your jar and stick it in the freezer. The one I provided is rhubarb freezer jam, which involves cooking up the rhubarb slightly because rhubarb is kind of a tough texture to it, to break down that tough texture, and mixing it with sugar and Jell-O. And the Jell-O gives it that jammy texture, and put it in the freezer. It also works for a combination of rhubarb and strawberry. Fantastic. If you're somebody that is growing strawberries, chances are you are inundated with strawberries. This is a great way to store them. That's my freezer section. Anyone have any freezer questions? Yes.
I just have a comment about the phrase. There's one about the work with I think maybe most folks are wearing silicone variety, and those are really wonderful. They also come in different sizes, so I have some half cup ones, which really provide a nice serving size. So you use the amount of pesto you use. I might order more pesto in my dishes. I'll full on half pesto, frozen pesto.
So for everyone online, it was shared that there are ice cube trays can be difficult to pop things out of and are essentially ice cube sized portions, but there are products out there that are silicone that come in a variety of sizes because not everybody wants a teeny little amount of pesto, apparently. They make them in half cup portions. So there's lots of opportunities out there to find ways to store things in the freezer. Yes.
Sorry, I was gonna say one more thing. There was comment online and also from us back here in the room about that we wash our plastic bags and we use them for free.
Absolutely. If you're going to reuse your plastic bag, then it's a sustainable way to go as well, for sure.
I have a comment too. We always freeze a lot of things every summer, big blueberries and pesto. We have like that thing, but where I live, for some reason, it seems to always be the first place that has a power outage, and then we end up. I mean, it's literally panic. Like, what are we doing? We can't lose our berries and our pesto. So anyway, I don't know if there's some sustainable thing where we could sort of share things and not kind of put a waste and a power outage happen.
So just to share with everyone online, that was a comment question about all this wonderful freezing in the freezer, but if you have power outages, then that can cause some panic and concern for sure. So I'm open to suggestions about how to manage. Yes.
I don't know where you can take this, and I don't know if I'm saying it loud enough to be picked up on the computer, but I have heard a trick is, you have a power outage and you're not sure if the stuff in your freezer is safe. A good technique is to take a cup of water, let it freeze, put a penny on top, add a little bit more water, let that freeze. And then if you go away for vacation, your lights are blinking, you don't know how long, the penny's still on top. It didn't freeze enough for anything else in the fridge to have gone, or the freezer to have gone back.
That's an interesting technique. So a suggestion is to know whether you had an outage that was enough to melt things in the freezer is to freeze a cup of water and then put a penny on top and then keep that in the freezer. If it thaws in the freezer and the penny drops, then even if it's refrozen, you'll know that the penny was not in the right place. So everything else in the freezer also thawed and then refroze. For sure. That's a great idea. Not the happy idea, because that's only an after the fact. I will say our own personal experience has been when we have had power outages because we're slightly out of town. We will coordinate with friends in town who are on a different grid and rush our stuff to their freezer. So we have wonderful friends that have helped us out for sure. That is definitely
you doesn't see it in internet, right, you know, you get out of here and then you have to read it out.
Absolutely. Yes.
I was gonna say too, that you're familiar with the Facebook Buy Nothing pages. I mean, I know that those people are likely to be in your same situation, but it's possible to even just share it if more people can help it. You did.
Certainly, you can, if you are desperate, reach out to Buy Nothing to share space if you need it. All right, let's move on to dehydrating, because that, to me, is one of my favorites.
Something to say.
No, he's good. Okay, so some things, especially herbs, are super easy to dehydrate. You can grow herbs on your porch, flip the leaves. Again, my trusty cookie sheet with some wax paper on it. I just spread the leaves out. If it's oregano or mint or dill, spread the leaves out, put them on my counter until the leaves are dry. I will strip the leaves from the stems because I ultimately don't want the stems. Leave it till it's fully dry and then put it in a jar. Super, no skill required, easy. Oregano is fantastic. I haven't bought oregano since I started growing it 18 years ago. And I will warn you, if you are used to using oregano from the store, you might want to cut down how much you use because this has so much more flavor, so much better. So that's my oregano. This is my dill. So that's the easy, just spread it on a sheet and let it dry. More complicated is the dehydrator. I love my dehydrator. And my dehydrator comes with trays that are stackable. I actually have 8 that will stack onto my dehydrator. I spread out my whatever I want. If it's gonna dry and get too small, there's a screen that I can put so that it doesn't fall through. And then there's also the fruit leather sheet for doing other things as well. One of my favorites is dried tomato halves. I take typically the ones that are like Juliet size from the farmer's market. I cut them in half. Again, I pull the seeds out. I spread them on the tray, and that doesn't require the extra bits. Just lay them out, cut side up, run the dehydrator until they are super dry. And then they will store for years that way. Rehydrating them, I will tell you, I actually learned this from Barbara Kingsolver in her book, Animal Vegetable Miracle. Yes, she talked about taking the dried tomatoes and boiling some vinegar, pouring the vinegar over them to rehydrate them and throw them in salad. It's fantastic. Super great for winter to have tomatoes that are fresh and local. But I'll also dehydrate them with water if I want to not have that zing, or I'll throw them directly into pasta sauce if I want to go that way. This is definitely one of my favorite things to dehydrate. I have also dehydrated apple slices. I love these. These are candy. I slice my apples. You can see I don't peel them. I do core them. Slice my apples. I dip them in some lemon juice just because I like that little zing to it. And again, lay them out on the dehydrator sheets and dry them until really crisp so that they'll snap. You can also do dehydrating in your oven if your oven will go to a low enough setting. You don't want to cook things. You don't want it to be at 250 degrees. That's too hot. But there are guidelines again for dehydrating you can find that also on the extension website. I will say also, I think this is a fantastic book. This is Rodale's Stocking Up. my copy is a little old at this point, but it's a great how to do everything with everything. You can always find a recipe somewhere for how to dehydrate. Celery, I'm going to say, is another great thing you might not think to dehydrate, both the leaves and the stems. And I do them separately. The leaves, I'll leave kind of like oregano and crumble them up and put them in soups. Or another great thing is cheese dip is great with that. But the celery stems, I'll cut into pieces, I'll dehydrate, and then I will use my handy coffee grinder that has never seen coffee and grind it up into a powder and make celery powder. And that is also a fantastic thing to put into soups or to put into dips. I do powdered lemon peel from organic lemons that I get at the store when I'm typically doing my apple slices. I will use the juice to dip, and then I will take the peels and dry those. And dried lemon peel is fantastic. This is my tomato junk. I've been talking about pulling the seeds out of my tomatoes for drying, or for doing the roasted tomatoes in the kitchen, or if you're doing sauce and you're peeling your tomatoes or running them through a sieve, all that junk, seeds and skins, I'll spread that out on my fruit leather sheet and dry that to fully crisp, run it through my handy grinder and make tomato powder. And I'll use the tomato powder when I'm doing like ground beef taco instead of, store-bought stuff. Or if I'm making chili, or if I want, it's almost got a tomato paste intensity to it. So it can just be hydrated into a sauce and add an extra richness. I think the tomato junk is that's what I call it, tomato junk. Is a great thing to do. And then the last, I did also want to mention, so you can dry lots of things, and especially if you're going to powder them, carrots or kale. If you like smoothies, you can make powders that you can put into your smoothies. And mushrooms, I'm going to say, is another great thing. There's actually a farmer at the farmers market who sells dried mushroom powder, and I will say it is expensive. So if you have extra mushrooms, or sometimes I'll take the stems off of my mushrooms when I'm cooking with them, and I'll dehydrate the stems and grind those up and get that same great mushroom stuff. And then you've saved yourself. And then the last thing I do is fruit leather. And fruit leather is essentially blended up fruit puree spread onto the sheet, and typically oiling the sheet just slightly so that it will come off again. And I like to do a little apple sauce if I'm going to do like raspberries. It's a little raspberry apple fruit leather, so it's got some texture to it. And it's just like the stuff in the store. It's got that pliable leather texture to it. And kids especially think that's fantastic. Any questions on dehydrating? Yes.
I looked to purchase a food dehydrator. I noticed that there is a big price variation. You can spend $40, you can spend almost $300. Are there any features that we should be looking for? Or is a $40 dehydrator just fine? I mean,
So the question was about the dehydrators that are out there on the market.
Yeah.
And certainly there are some that are very large and handle a large volume of stuff. There's also the benefit, mine has a hole in the middle, which can be, if you want nice sheets of fruit leather, you can't get that because they'll be circles with holes in the middle. They'll donut shapes. But I'd say the biggest difference in dehydrators is the ability to control the temperature and the airflow.
Okay.
Mine, you plug in and it does what it's going to do. And I tend to move the trays as it's drying because some of the levels are hotter and get more air than others. And I will take off pieces as they dry. Some of them have wonderful temperature controls. And especially if you're going to dry like beef jerky, it requires a certain temperature to be reached.
Okay.
So that's important. But if you're doing tomatoes, the cheap one is fine. I would say the other difference is going to be size. That you'll get a little one and it's shocking the quantity of stuff you put into the dehydrator that comes out with a little jar. And it's just like, that's it? That's all I got?
Well, it
But-
takes a long time, right?
But the intensity, and it does take many hours. I'll have to run this for a full day for some things, for sure. So it does take a while, and it does use electricity. Yes,
You said something about the oven. Notice that my oven has this thing warm and it's 170 degrees. That good.
I would say if you want to try using your oven to do dehydrating, and it has that warm setting that's 170 degrees, you probably want to prop the door open slightly because you want both the warmth and the airflow. And that's the big thing with the dehydrator is it's mostly a blower, blowing air. But if you've got the oven and you don't have the dehydrator, try it.
And you know, and if you don't do it much, it might.
Yeah, if you're not gonna do, if you're just gonna use it to try, you may find that you use your oven to do some dehydrating and you think it is the best thing ever in the whole world, and you're gonna go out and spend $400 for the super fancy, ginormous dehydrator thing, because that's gonna be your passion. Or you may decide that the oven is fine,
It's all right.
but I will say to be careful when you dehydrate that things are in fact dry. Sometimes I'll do berries in the dehydrator halfway so that, like blueberries, they'll shrink down, but they'll still be a little squishy. And I'll put those in a container in the freezer because they still have moisture in them. So if you put them on the shelf, they will mold. But if you put them in the freezer, they take up much less space than the full berries. And they're perfect for putting into muffins and quick breads. Any other questions on, yes?
I just want to comment on the cat. So somebody said they were raw fooded for 3 years, but the Excalibur dehydrator is great if you want your food to be alive.
I don't know what that means, but I will assume everybody online saw that comment, and so we'll go with that. But yeah, there are lots of stuff out there, for sure. The last thing is canning, and I'm not gonna give you all the details about how to can, but in general, a water bath canner is a large pot with a rack so that the cans, the jars don't sit on the heat directly. And you put your jars of, in this case, applesauce into the canner with the new lids on them, and it'll seal. Water bath canning is for foods that are acidic or sugared, such as pickles and jams and some fruits. If it is not acidic or sugared, water bath is not safe. You have to use a pressure canner. So absolutely, positively, consult a guide and consult a recent guide, because these things are changing over time. Things like tomatoes, if you want to can tomatoes or tomato sauce, you have to be aware that today's tomatoes are less acidic than tomatoes from 30 years ago. So that can affect the safety of canning. Typically, what that means when I do canned tomato sauce is I add citric acid to make sure it's acid enough. It doesn't really affect the overall product when I go to use it. I haven't ever noticed. but it makes it the difference between safe and not safe. If you want to do things that are not acidic, there's pressure canning. And pressure canning will allow you to can things like beans and corn and soups and anything else that's lower in acid. Typically what I like to can is applesauce, tomato sauce, jams, of course. And this is a hot dog relish made with zucchini. People were asking about zucchini. I make a hot dog relish with zucchini and onions that I got, and I did not provide that on the list here, but I got that from the new zucchini cookbook, which is also another suggestion I have for if you have lots of zucchini. There's, I don't know, 101 ways to deal with zucchini, and it includes things like dehydrating. I will say I have dehydrated zucchini in the past, and just to get off topic and talk about zucchini, it's a lot of water in zucchini, and when you dehydrate it, you concentrate it down. Concentrated oregano is awesome. Concentrated tomato is awesome. Concentrated zucchini to me was not so much. It was a little intense flavored, but that's saying you could dehydrate it and then rehydrate it into soups or stews if you wanted to use it that way. I would say that's an awesome concept, and you could try that in your oven and see how that goes. I will again talk about some reference books here. My zucchini book I love. The Rodale's book is great. Ball puts out a new book every year with the latest, greatest methods of canning. And they are also, their website is great for how to, and of course it's how to use their containers, how to use their lids, how to buy all their fancy jars, but there's so many fun jars out there nowadays that you can do all sorts of wonderful canning and providing stuff or storing your dried stuff, including these plastic lids are fantastic. Just a note, if you're gonna make the bouillon, it's heavy salt, it will corrode a metal lid. So the plastic lid is important to use. And then I have Food Drying with Attitude is another one that I like. It's got all sorts of fun stuff, including lots of fruit leather ideas. But the library, both this branch and all of the other branches, have a fantastic variety of books. And I am hoping that I am giving you the confidence to try your hand at one or many of these things. Easiest is just the refrigerator. Most risky, complex is the canning, just because you tend to store it on the shelf. And so if it is not properly sealed, throw it away. But that is my presentation. Yes?
There's a question online about pressure canning. It said, I put hot vinegar mixed over pepperoni powder and they came out mushy. I wonder if that inside.
I don't actually have a pressure canner. I've never done that. And hot peppers are not my thing either. So I'm not the best person to ask on that specific question. But I will say definitively look on a website or check out a book or try it again and just try, because there's so much wonderful produce out there right now, and you'll enjoy it so much better in the winter than going to the grocery store, because you'll have put all that love and enthusiasm into it. So yes.
Are you aware of any in-person shops, like taking this a step further to like actually
Hands-on.
like
I am not aware of hands-on. Oh, you are?
The extension department in Christiansburg is going to offer a training course this fall.
Oh,
Okay.
I know why I brought that in. I don't know if it goes into special training or not,
okay.
but I think it was nice, maybe, but if you were.
It's a series, like it's not
series,
the one
a little bit, but
So The extension office is offering in Christiansburg a in-person canning class
Right.
this fall.
Right.
Absolutely awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
fantastic. In that case, I think that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for all your recipes for sharing those.
Absolutely.
And a lot of these are things I wouldn't think to do, you know, like that bullion thing. I never.
I only started doing